There's like this either-or argument about higher ed sometimes, which is, oh, it wasn't about the economic value, it's about good citizens and good citizenry, and you're like, okay, but that's actually not something we should trade off for a great job.
So they want us to talk about disrupting talent pathways.
Okay.
And so I was recalling that I think the first JFF event that you spoke at was our very first Impact Employer Summit. And I remember, I think what intrigued you to come to that was because you felt that employers were such an important kind of focus and consumer of this message.
Yeah.
So fast forward now 4 or 5 years since then, how do you think of this now, kind of the interplay between higher ed and employers?
Yeah. I certainly think it's advanced, meaning that for all the focus and attention that employers rightfully give to their employees that they currently have, they're recognizing the same challenges at even their smaller scale than the entire U.S. workforce, that they have a accelerating percentage of their total population that are going to be retiring or that they're moving on, et cetera. That's compounded. That challenge of maintaining the skilled workforce is compounded by the fact that the shelf life of skills is shortening. The impact of advancing tools and technology tools, whether it's everyone's favorite topic right now, AI, or whether it was blockchain before that, or whether it was just even the internet and big data, et cetera, like the skill sets that are needed are rapidly advancing. At the same time, there are the macro challenges, like we don't have more college graduates now than we did before. Like we don't have more, new children into the work, new children being born than we did before. Like, and immigration policy is such that it's like, well, the volume of new talent into the workforce is not going to increase dramatically, if it increases at all. I think it's mostly projected to be flat or down. And the changing pace of the skills that are needed, while also having a population of workers that are nearing a retirement, meaning the percentage that are over 40 is a higher percent now than it was before. You're like, this is a huge challenge for employers. And so I think what they're recognizing is that the humans that they have are the most critical and most strategic ingredient to their organizational success. And they're trying to figure out how to secure those talent pipelines in a way that they didn't have to think about as much as before, right? And so that's especially true in certain fields. I mean, cybersecurity is the very obvious one. Is like, oh no, the digital age that we live in is like every industry and every employer in those respective industries has huge needs around securing their data and their, their technology-enabled activities and processes. Like it's a real challenge. I certainly see within the healthcare workforce the same need. You have massive gaps in terms of the total number of nurses that are needed today, and it's only increasing because of the aging population. And so these employers recognize, like, if they want to maintain any prospect of growth, innovation, greater productivity, efficiency, for all those initiatives they're trying to drive, they're totally dependent upon humans. And if they have the prospect of fewer of them than they did before, like, well, guess what? Talent moved up the list in terms of strategic priorities for most leaders. And so what does that mean? I think that they're also looking at talent providers, whether it was the post-secondary system, as more strategically important partners than they had before. They're also looking at alternative pathways at a much more accelerated way than they were before. And I would arguably say that more attention is being given to the alternative pathways because I think they're reasonable in their assumption that says we're not all of a sudden going to magically double the number of people enrolled in post-secondary. Yep. You're not going to go from 20 million to all of a sudden 40 million people enrolled in post-secondary pathways. But we certainly can get apprenticeships from sub-million to several million. We certainly can get micro-credentials from hundreds of thousands to millions of people being upskilled through micro-credential pathways, through paid internships and other models by which you can do that. So I would say that as a matter of necessity, employers are certainly seeing talent as a more strategic, of more strategic importance today than they were 5 years ago when we first talked about this.
And you mentioned healthcare, and I know you and I were on a panel in Boston a couple months ago. Yeah. And you shared some pretty staggering statistics about the healthcare work that you're doing at WGU. Like, what are some of those numbers?
Oh yeah, like the examples like of nurses, bachelors of nursing in the United States, 17% of them got their bachelor's from WGU.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
So one institution accounting for 17%. 5% of all nurses of the healthcare workforce are also WGU graduates. And now we have a growing demand in related health fields, whether it's in health informatics or even in psychology and therapists. And we know that that's a huge demand for that. I would only anticipate that our enrollment and the number of graduates in that grows. There was a period in the pandemic, the prior discussion much about how aviation was affected by the pandemic, so was healthcare. Yep. And I was listening to the conversations about how the aviation industry had well, I don't know if I want to go into that in the pandemic. I'm like, well, multiply that times 10, and that's how people were feeling about the healthcare workforce, and that put hospitals and health systems in a much more dire situation because nursing looked like the least attractive profession in the era of the pandemic. I don't know if I can call it an era, but at least the period of the pandemic. And so I think we see that finally emerging out of that. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. Like, the clinical demands that are upon our healthcare workforce are really high, such that burnout is a pretty serious issue in the healthcare workforce, which would imply there's going to be greater turnover, which means you need to have a very fat pipeline of new talent into the healthcare workforce. So.
And so what do you think it is about WGU's approach to the nursing program that is different, that's a differentiator? Because I think, your share of the market, so to speak, has really grown over the past couple of years. It's
interesting. Those of you who haven't paid attention to WGU, which to me, frankly, I'll say is like somewhat surprising sometimes, because you're like, all right, I don't know how many new graduates we're supposed to produce before people go like, oh, WGU, I've heard of WGU. So I do go back to maybe some simple key ingredients to the differentiation. One is that we remove time and place as a barrier to accessing education. The conventional phrase of college is not for me was mostly an articulation of whether or not in person, on campus, in classroom, whether that model and everything that's associated with it actually fit into someone's really busy life. And so that started with this simple thing. It's like, well, time and place is a massive barrier to making education and the pathways it affords really accessible to all the working adults that exist out there. And so you certainly know this stat, but roughly 35% of the U.S. workforce have a post-secondary credential. You're like, well, okay, let's roughly say that's 60 of 165 million people. You're like, so what about the other 100 million individuals? And don't they also need knowledge, skill, and ability education? You're like, and what are the barriers to making that accessible to them? Like, oh, well, probably the primary barrier is time, geographic proximity, and cost. Yep. And so if you first say, why don't we leverage this internet thing? And I say the internet thing because literally when the governors dreamed up the idea of WGU, it was 1996, 1997, we were incorporated. The internet was still pretty nascent. Early adopters were messing around in chat rooms and occasionally buying something online, but it wasn't like until, post 97 where, things still started accelerating. But guess what it did? It democratized access in a way that no other tool could before that. And so when I say that, particularly in higher education, the approach before was like, well, let's try to put a public campus near as many residents of our state as we could. And so you have states like North Carolina, 58 campuses of the community college system. Every North Carolinian is within 30 minutes of a campus. You're like, that sounds really, really expensive. And hey, this internet thing, all of a sudden, education was accessible to you and you never had to leave your house. Or often your place of work. Wherever you had internet access, you can now access education. I think the other key factor in time was that rather than following a set schedule, we shifted it and said, we're going to allow you to fit the consumption of learning into your already busy schedule. So rather than having a lecture schedule that you had to be online for, we just viewed that as content and just allow individuals to consume that learning when they're able to consume the learning and work with then your instructors and your mentors in a one-on-one basis on your time. So it started making our instructional model more like a tutoring and a 24/7 office hour model versus a traditional model was like, Oh no, I went to class and I listened to the professor drone on about some subject that I was going to then go read the textbook and try to fill in all the blanks with. Now you're like, oh no, the individual can consume a lot of that, doing it a self-paced way, et cetera. So those are key elements that I think we often, we tend to gloss over. We underestimate how these simple things dramatically change the model of things. Now, that's not the only thing we did in healthcare. In healthcare, we also invested heavily in simulation labs to start to reduce the at-work clinical load, so you can do a lot of the
And are they like
development.
in different places around the country?
We try to make them more geographically accessible. Like, I don't have 58 of them yet, but you never know. We may have 58 of them. And so you do have to make them more accessible, but now when you have simulation labs, you have less of the capacity constraints that exist within traditional hospitals and health systems, et cetera. So clinical capacity is often one of the biggest constraints to educating a healthcare workforce, and so that's still one of the bigger constraints. But when you reduce that load, then you also can then invest in expanding the partnership network that exists to say, if you're trying to provide nursing programs across all 50 states in the nation, you better have a lot of employer partners. Yep. And so this is one of the differentiators of WGU too, is that we actually brought the employers into that educational journey. We have all of our site supervisors and those who are observing the practicum or the practical application of the students in those environments. And so now that's also developing a network and affinity with employers that you might want to get a job at. The employers are getting familiarity with these rising graduates. And it starts to improve the overall working of that education to work life cycle.
I know you often think of flywheel approaches.
Yeah.
So that sounds like
for sure.
Those.
That's one of those things is like if you attract a lot of students at scale, guess who else starts showing up? Well, employers start showing up, philanthropy and funders start showing up, policy starts showing up. Because when you can create that large scale talent development, machine, if you will, there are many beneficiaries to that. We often talk at WGU that first and foremost, the student is our primary customer. There's no doubt that if we stop delivering value for that individual, then everything else will fall apart. But when you put the student at the center of that, you also then realize employers are also a customer of WGU. Why? Because we're providing highly skilled employees or highly skilled talent into that strategic workforce. So they become a partner. And when you graduate 50,000 a year, it's like, well, there's a lot of employers that can benefit from 50,000 graduates.
Do you track the employment outcomes
we
of
do.
those graduates?
Yeah, very much so. I think this is back to our question about the talent life cycle. Maybe the key premise is that education is not an end in and of itself. It's actually a means to an end. It's how do you activate talent into opportunity. And so to actually know that pathway is working, we really focus on three key things. And the two first ones are, if you start, you complete. And having completed, did you get a return on the pathway? Meaning, did it actually lead to opportunity? And so we will track what are your economic gains within 2 years of graduation relative to your earnings at the time of start. What are your employment rates in field of study? What is your overall engagement rate at your employer? We track overall well-being in partnership with Gallup, for example. We also track overall kind of promotion and progress. We're actually just about to start a longitudinal study of the 340,000 plus graduates to see whether the value proposition, that elevated value proposition, whether it persists over life and not just in the first kind of 2 years after graduation as well. And so that's the second key result, which is there a return for the graduates? And the third one is equity, meaning that promise of education is the surest path to opportunity. It has to work for everyone. Your background, your income in your household, your race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, these are not determinants of your worth, nor of your innate capacity for learning. It's like you're a human, therefore you have all of that. And so therefore the pathways have to work for you. And that shouldn't be we shouldn't see disparities in that. And so we want to make sure that at WGU, regardless of who you are, you have an equal probability of success.
And so I know I'm on the board of the Post-Secondary Commission that Steve is leading. And I know you guys have talked, and so that's an effort that is really looking to build a new type of higher ed accreditor that would actually look at the ROI and the kind of economic returns of graduates. And so what do you think of that because you all are already doing it, but I think you're pretty unique in that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a way we should have the whole field go?
I do. I think one of the simple things that I like to say, oddly, I have to sometimes yell it because there's like this either-or argument about higher ed sometimes, which is, it wasn't about the economic value, it's about good citizens and good citizenry, and you're like, okay, but that's actually not something we should trade off for a great job. And what I have to sometimes be very clear about is, we certainly believe at WG that one of the most noble things you can do is enable a person to live a self-determined life. Mm-hmm. One of the most important ingredients into that is whether or not you're economically self-reliant. Yep. And that you're earning at a threshold that allows you to actually have optionality, that allows you to have some degree of savings, that you can deal with a shock in a pandemic, that you can actually save for retirement, that you can afford your children's upbringing and education. There's a threshold at which that actually happens, that the individual feels like they're an agent. Is there anything more noble than enabling an individual's agency? And the economic, prosperity is a key factor, if not the key factor in that. So I think that's the noble endeavor that we've undertaken. I do believe that we can move institution and sector accountability in that direction. Mm-hmm. That's simply because not being from traditional higher ed, my background was in the private sector. I ended up in higher ed because of a board hiring mistake, but it's been fun ever since I've been in there to think a little bit differently. But the point is, when I look at the history of even higher ed in the US, I think the assumption was always that education was the pathway to opportunity, such that whether you want to look at the Moral Act and the public land grant, whether you want to look at the GI bill, whether you want to look at the Higher Ed Act, federal student aid, all of that was with the assumption that education was the great equalizer. It was the way to increase the prospect of every American to have the American dream. And yet we had institutions all of a sudden developing their own models or incentives to say, well, we don't think everyone should participate in this. College isn't for everyone. And what they're not saying is, they're not saying education isn't for me. They're just saying the way that we ended up creating it, that doesn't work for me. And yet we keep funding this thing like, oh no, that's supposed to work for everyone. You're like, actually, we're trying to say education should work for everyone. So it was interesting, again, to think about aviation. It's like, why are we not making that possible to be funded and afforded for those who want to pursue that? Yep. Why are we not looking at apprenticeships that way? Why are we not looking at micro-credentials that way, other shorter duration programs? Like, oh no, the only thing that is eligible is a degree program in a one and done model. Go 2 years or 4 years or another 2 years. Nope, and you do it between 18 and 25 preferably, and then somehow the rest of your life takes care of yourself. Actually, I think we always long believed that economic outcomes was the best measure of education's worth. And that, as I like to say, I've never met a good citizen who didn't also have a great job. Yeah.
So back to the employer piece. Who pays? In an ideal world, how do you think about, what the individual pays? What should employers be contributing? Where should federal policy kick in? What do you think is the right balance there?
Well, it's something different than what we have. Because arguably you have families, individuals, and taxpayers paying for it. And I think that's on the basis of the family and the individual's belief in their own prosperity outcomes of education. But on the federal side, it's often founded primarily in the notion of a public good or public benefit side of it. But education isn't like a defense. It's not like public parks. Such that if employers are benefiting from it, I think there are ways by which, if it's driving real value to you in terms of having the skilled talent you need to fill the critical roles that are strategically important to your organization, and it also has economic benefit to you because now you've reduced the cost of turnover, you've reduced the cost of vacancy, you've reduced the cost of hiring temporary staffing and workers, that it's economically important to you to have the ability, if you will, to sponsor rising talent.
Yep.
So the emerging model of employer-sponsored talent is a pretty good one. I certainly went to, I was in a program that the employer that I had at the time was willing to sponsor that. Interestingly, it was a higher degree. I mean, it was a post-bachelor's degree. They're like, well, why aren't we doing that with bachelor's degrees? Like, what would it look like if, in fact, employers were now, meeting those rising graduates who are declaring majors and you're into those fields and say, by the way, these employers are interested in, rising graduates in these majors. And should you be willing to entertain a 5-year employment commit with these types of employers, they may sponsor your last 2 years of college, which means they fund it up front, and that funding is fully paid back by the employer, et cetera. And you effectively got your education paid for all of a 5-year commitment for a paid job. And so I think there are models that we can certainly learn from that have existed out there around employer sponsorship.
Scott, thanks for being here.
Thanks,
Scott
Maria.
also just joined the JFF Board of Directors, so thank you for doing that. Looking forward to working more closely with you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.